The oldest and strongest human emotion is fear. And the oldest and strongest type of fear is trepidation of the unknown. When we were children, our parents told us that monsters didn't exist. But we were sure that something was lurking under the bed or in the closet. Fear sees, even if our eyes are closed. Welcome to the realm of the arcane. My name is Lon Strickler. Join me as I examine unexplained creatures, strange manifestations, and remarkable realities. Imagine this next hour as a voyage of discovery to strange lands, seeking not for new territory, but for new knowledge of the supernatural. Come on board as we begin this adventure together. Hey folks, good evening and welcome to another episode of Arcane Radio. I'm your host, Lon Strickler, and I thank you for joining me here on the Paranormal King Radio Network. Now, before I introduce my guest, I want to mention a recent account. This account was forwarded to me by the witness a couple weeks ago. Last year, I was backpacking with my brother in the mountains of West Virginia. To get to our destination, we had to drive for about 2 hours up a very long and deep-ditched road. After reaching the mountain, we got out all our gear and started on our hour-long hike into the woods. Our destination was at the edge of a small lake. Behind us was a long path back to the car, which was covered by fallen trees and thick brush. The area was surrounded by high, jagged cliffs. Now, after about an hour of resting, we set up camp and started a fire. We proceeded to cook as the sun set over the large rock wall across the lake from us. Just after the sun went down is when the strangeness began. Every half hour or so, my brother would hear what he said were soft footsteps coming from the trail behind us. I was really tired and kept blowing it off as a joke. However, as the night passed on, he refused to stop talking about what he was hearing. I told him to shut up because I was tired of hearing it. At around 11 p.m., the situation became more bizarre. I had nodded off with my head propped up on a log. Then suddenly a large crash could be heard from across the lake. My brother and I both got to our feet, grabbed our shotgun and .44 Magnum, and walked to the edge of the lake to see if we could spot what had made the noise. After a minute of staring in the pitch black night, we decided to go back and lay down. We both thought it must have been a loose boulder that had fallen off the face of the ridge. That was until my brother told me to stop in an abrupt whisper. "Look there," he said, pointing towards the ridge to our left. It was then that I realized my brother really was hearing things all night long. About 100 yards away from us in the tree line was a figure that looked to be at least 10 foot tall with glowing golden eyes. Now, paralyzed with fear, my brother and I watched the large figure sway back and forth, never taking its eyes off us. "Let's get the F out of here," my brother yelled while shooting a round from his .44 mag into the lake. At this point, the figure stopped and stared. Its eyes seemed to get larger and brighter. Then, just as quickly, the eyes were gone. We immediately started stoking the fire as fast as we could. Not knowing if the figure would return, we decided to stay up all night taking turns adding logs to the fire. After an hour or so, we heard a faint rustling in the brush. The rustling then stopped when all of a sudden this thing roared out in the most terrible scream that I ever heard. We grabbed our guns and gear. It was time to leave. We both started to sprint into the darkness with our lights turned off. We ran into the woods for at least 10 minutes until the two of us were out of breath and stopped. We turned on our lights to find a path and listen for the creature. It was moving up towards us. We could hear the pounding of the footsteps and branches snapping. This time the lights stayed on as we ran nonstop, tripping over obstacles until we reached the car. The two of us threw our gear into the vehicle and locked the doors behind us. My brother was shaking from fear and fumbling with his keys. Just as he got the key in the ignition, a loud scream of the creature blasted from the darkness. He started the car and gunned it. I don't know what that thing was. All I can say is I'll never return to those woods to find out. Now, the witness, I finally was able to talk to the witness after about a week or so. From the information I was given, I believe the area was in the higher regions of the Monongahela National Forest, possibly near Bald Knob. The incident occurred in the summer of 2017. By the way, I believe it may have been a Bigfoot, but I wouldn't rule out an upright canine because of the eye color. But there have been historical reports of both in that general area. So let's get started. Tonight's guest is Rita Louise, who is a medical intuitive and author. Rita is the founder of the Institute of Applied Energetics and the host of Just Energy Radio. She is a naturopathic physician and a 20-year veteran in the human potential field. Her unique gift as a medical intuitive and clairvoyant illuminates and enlightens her work. She has written several books, including the latest title, Stepping Out of Eden. She has also produced a number of feature-length video as well as video shorts. Dr. Louise has a degree in naturopath and a Ph.D. in natural health counseling. She has also received the distinction of Reiki Master and Certified Hypnotherapist. You can find her website at soulhealer.com. So Rita, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Lon. How are you doing?
Pretty good. We haven't talked in a while.
In a long while, but I do see your stuff on Facebook. So, there are things that I hate about Facebook. And then there's the part where it's like you can kind of vicariously keep up with people, by just watching your feed, Yeah,
that is kind of one of the only good things about Facebook, I guess. Now, can you tell my listeners how you started on the road to the medical, physical, and enlightenment?
Sure. So growing up, there was a TV show called The Amazing Kreskin, and then another TV show called The Sixth Sense. So not the movie, but a TV series that featured Gary Collins, who was a college professor who had ESP. And I just thought that between those two shows, that it was just beyond fascinating, and I wanted to know what that was all about. And so moved from reading books on archaeology and anthropology to reading books on psychic abilities and stuff like that. And as I like to say, and I read and was getting pretty smart, but still wasn't getting psychic at all. And finally found the Berkeley Psychic Institute and studied with them and discovered that I had been very psychic my whole life. And when I finished taking that training, one of the things that I found was that I was able to find people's health issues. Everybody has their own thing that they vibrate with, so some people talk to dead people. Some people are really good with past lives or looking at your contracts or reading your Akashic records. For some reason, looking at people's bodies and telling them what's wrong is something I'm very good at. And so I went back to school because the first question people asked was, well, what can I do about it? And I had nothing. I had nothing. Meditate, that was my answer. So went back to school to get a degree as a naturopath, which is a holistic physician. So they don't work with prescription drugs, but more with herbs and supplements and dietary changes and nutrition. And then got a PhD in natural health counseling. So
interesting. Mm-hmm. Well, we're kind of on the same wavelength there, I suppose. I found out I was an intuitive when I was 8 years old, and it kind of stuck with me. I never really dwelled on it, to be honest with you, but it was it's something I've always had, and I've kind of gotten a little better as I've gotten older. I can only really sense energy, spiritual energy. And occasionally I can tell if someone has an issue, possibly physically wise, but I've never really delved into that. So what you do is quite interesting to me.
Well, I'll share a quick story, and this was like way before I like found out I was psychic. Um, but in hindsight, it was like this huge psychic moment, which would happen to me all the time, and I didn't know that when I would do these things, I was actually doing psychic things. I just thought it was like a very strange coincidence. But I worked at a company. I was like 20 years old. And in the office next door, it was a lab. There was this guy who was my friend. We were about the same age. And then his manager, who was older. I'll just say that, older. And he drank tab and I drank tab. And so every day at 3:00, we would go down, my friend and I would go down and get a soda, and I would bring him back a soda, a tab. And that was pretty much our relationship. I'd say hi, but we never like talked or anything. And so he didn't come into work one day, no big deal. So the next day I went into the lab to say good morning to everybody. And so this is coming from like a 20-year-old perspective. And so I hope no one's offended by how this comes out, but and so he had like a really good comb over happening, but you could see like on his head that he had a little round Band-Aid on the top of his head. And so I thought that he had like maybe had a zit up there and it had gotten like kind of red and pussy. So he put one of those little round Band-Aids on top so you wouldn't have to look at it because, it wasn't that great of a comb over. And so that was what was going on in my cognitive mind, because it's kind of sick most of the time. And I And I walked over to the man and I crossed my arms and I looked him in the face and I said, well, where were you yesterday? Having them check for a brain tumor? And his face turned white and he turned around and walked out of the room. And I had no idea what was going on, except every hair on my body was standing on end. And I had this electric current going through my body. And I went back to my desk and my friend, his assistant, ripped me the riot act because the manager thought that he had told me what was going on. But I didn't know. And so like in hindsight, that was like a pretty powerful, like psychic, medical, intuitive thing. But in the moment, I would never have called myself psychic or having a psychic thing because I wasn't psychic yet. I mean, I was, but I wasn't, if that makes sense.
So Stepping Out of Eden it's a fascinating book. There's a lot to it. Now, that being said, in your opinion, are humans an evolved species or an amalgamation of other life forms as an engineered species?
I firmly believe that humanity, as we see it today, is an engineered species. But my feeling is that all life on Earth has been manufactured. That evolution didn't really happen, or there were some bouts of evolution, but not in the way that they want you to think based on accepted scientific theory, because it just doesn't work.
Right. I've always been a strong evolutionist. And, I just can't buy into the creation theory. But you know what? It kind of goes to my next question. You discuss progressive creationism in your book. Mm-hmm. Now, how is this any different than intelligent design, which I'm starting to buy into as I research more and more?
I mean, intelligent design makes the assumption that there is a energy or something that pushes, I don't really have a really good definition for it, but that there's an energy that compels us to grow and change. I mean, I was a hardcore evolution person. I mean, I was all about it. And, but in my research, and when you take a step back, well, actually, in my last book, E.T. Chronicles, one of the things that I uncovered was the presence of extraterrestrials on the Earth at being part of the terraforming of the planet.
Right.
And so if they were here from all the way back then why are we so special that they only interfered in the genetic engineering of us?
Right.
And so I'm just kind of looking at the evidence that I have uncovered and going, I think it is very possible. And it makes it so that, there are a lot of missing links.
Absolutely.
How did we get eyes? How did flowering plants appear? There isn't anything in the fossil record to show this gradual process that just kind of appears. And no one knows why. We have these major extinction events, and then the next group of animals that come back aren't lesser beings. They're more evolved beings, which doesn't make any sense. And it happens very quickly, and they can't explain it. And if you can't explain something, or you try to do flips and spins to make the square peg fit in the round hole, well, maybe you shouldn't try to put the square peg in the round hole.
Well, I definitely believe there was some type of influence. Now what we were influenced by, were these some type of non-human beings, or was it a non-corporeal intelligence of some type? Do you believe that ancient man physically interacted with what they considered were gods?
Well, yes. But when we sit there and use the word God in the Western world, we end up with a lot of confusion because most people associate God with the omnipotent creator that underlies everything in our universe, regardless of your definition of that, and the characters that we find in mythology is not that.
Right.
One of the things that I have talked about is, when we think of God, when we think of the biblical God, that character, the creator of the universe, there is the notion that God is omnipotent, but what does that imply? That means that God, with a wiggle of his nose or a nod of his head or the snap of a finger, can create and manifest whatever he wants, can travel however he wants, and I like to use the character Q from Star Trek Next Generation. Q was truly omnipotent. He'd snap his fingers and there would be a mariachi band, and he'd wave his hand and the Enterprise would be, hundreds of thousands of light years away, and he'd make a galaxy, and, he would do all this stuff. And it was immediate and instantaneous. When we look at mythology, we have these stories of the gods flying around in aerial chariots. We have them using weapons against each other that were built by a different group of gods, the Master Builder group. So we find these things that are more human-like, and I hate to use, but corporeal, tied to corporeal beings, than we find to anyone that could possibly be omnipotent. Why would they need a weapon? Why would they need a chariot? They could snap their fingers and go to wherever they wanted.
Well, this goes back to a theory I have, which you may very well believe, that our human descendants have evolved to a state where they can actually travel back to our current time in order to change history, thus saving us from ourselves. Do you buy into that, any?
I think that it is a possibility. We don't really know. What we're basing, or what I base my material on, is, what I find in the mythic record and what I find in the archaeological record. And so there isn't anything to support it from a narrative standpoint. Right. But is it possible that that's where these people come from, or these characters come from? It's entirely possible. So I'm not going to negate it or poo-poo it, because we don't know. There's so much that we don't know.
Well, I'm gonna state something. I don't know how you're gonna take this, but
I'm sitting down. I'm sitting down.
Over the years, I've been looking into a lot of this similar type subjects as far as how civilizations were developed and such and so on, because there's just no archaeological record for a lot of what really happened, and how things developed to points. Even in the modern world, I mean, our technology has just increased so much over the past century. I have it on occasion. I've had visions of our past civilizations and things developing that I would have never thought of, quite honest with you. And it gets me thinking and wondering how a lot of what has happened in the historical record actually did happen, if archaeology is going to ever explain any of this.
As far as our advancement in, I'm going to say technology, meaning education and knowledge of how to make things work, is that kind of where you're going?
But not only that, but how things actually developed, how we, if we were given the technology by something,
Well, I mean, in the mythic record, it tells us that the gods gave us everything.
Right.
Everything,
Right.
From fire to agriculture to metallurgy to weaving to everything. And you read these stories and it's like, well, humanity was pretty dumb, and then there's some that suggest, and again, we don't know. So it's as valid a theory as any that are out there that the downed UFOs is another way that these gods are giving us advanced technology, so instead of interacting with people, landing on the White House lawn, kind of like Moses, the interaction that Moses had, that they're just kind of dropping it off and leaving it for us to access and utilize and use that to move forward technologically. And I think that's a valid conjecture. I mean, we can't prove it one way or the other, but right. I could see why, in the other stories, they're taught, and I don't think, if I turned around and said, I had these Zeta Reticuli people come and visit me and they taught me this stuff and I want to share it with you, I know where I would end up.
Oh, yeah, that's exactly what I'm trying to say. These what I call visions, I guess, that's the easiest way of saying what they are. When I present them to my colleagues and even people that read the blog and such, I know I drive them crazy by doing that, because most people want actual physical evidence of some type or something that has been in some type of research. But when you come off with a lot of this from the top of your head, or from something that I'm not saying I'm a prophet. Let's put it that way. Mm-hmm. But it does drive people nuts, and it is hard to get it across to some individuals about is this an ability I have that I can sense that or see that. And then the conundrum is trying to explain what I actually envision.
That's always a challenging part, but I'm going to kind of shift here, because I talked about the gods that are talked about in myth, and to me, the mythological gods seem like there was at least some corporealness to their nature, that they had bodies and that people saw them and interacted with them at some point in time.
Right.
But then there is this, and I'm going to say whole other group of gods that people were accessing during the ritual experience, and performing ritual and creating, which would be a group. It would, I mean, this sounds so politically incorrect, but I think people get this image, of a group of Native Americans dancing around the fire. People in the West look at it and it's like, they're a bunch of heathens. But there was just something very deep and esoteric in what they were doing, because they were creating ritual in order to raise the vibration of the community, which would raise the vibration of the shaman or the medicine men, so that they could move into a higher state of being and interact with these otherworldly souls, whether it was ancestors, whether it was these godly characters. There's not a whole lot of information, especially ancient, contemporary stuff. I'm a little hesitant on my believability meter. But the ethnographers who were documenting these rituals never asked what was the experience. They just talked about them dancing around the fire, but they would go into this ecstatic state in order to access higher level information. So when someone like yourself or myself meditates and allows information to come to us from our higher self, from God, from, some place, we are utilizing that same capability as our ancestors, except they were really good at it.
Oh, yeah. I mean, do you believe that maybe modern humans will eventually need to reconnect with ancient tradition and intuitiveness in order to survive?
Yeah, I mean, I think we are going so far off course and so, I'm going to say materialistic, and losing touch with ourselves, losing touch with the world around us, losing touch with, I'm going to say God, and I'm not really a religious person, but that higher consciousness that we all can tap into, that we all can connect with. And I think that that's part of the craziness that's going on, is that, people aren't grounding, people aren't stopping and breathing and reconnecting with themselves, to look at what's really going on. And I'm not making a judgment, one side or the other, but people are going crazy.
It just, even to the time when we were kids, it just seemed so much different. Social wise, but, and a lot of other things. It just seems like it's a more dangerous world out there, and it may very well be.
And the sad part is that we all really want the same thing. We want to live and be happy and feel secure and have a place to live and food to eat and be able to interact with the world around us. And there's just so much drama and so much disparity, between people and those that have and those that don't have, that it's just becoming more and more challenging. And, but when you don't have, it leaves you in a state of fear. And when you're in a state of fear, and I'm going to get kind of metaphysical here for a second, your first chakra shuts down, because your first chakra is associated with your survival energy. And so you can't let go. You can't release. Your energy gets totally stuck in your head. It gets stuck in your body. And it can make you kind of crazy like that, because it's not moving anywhere. It's just rolling around in your head. And there's a whole huge dynamic. Maybe I need to write an article on that. That might be kind of interesting.
And this is one thing I do like about social media, though. It's, you in a sense, you can't really tell if what you're reading is true. But overall, I think people are more open to issues, and you start to read how other people are living, what they're experiencing, and you have to come to the conclusion everybody's got real issues in this modern world, and it's just not It's just not what it was. It seems like I said before, like it was when we were younger.
But I think some of the things that get into this whole dynamic is electronics. I think that's huge.
Yeah.
I mean, when we were kids, it's like, what did you do? My mom kicked us out of the house. Like, go play.
Absolutely.
Come back in dark. Go run around and burn off all that energy and then come back before dark for dinner. And that was it. You know, and so you weren't hanging on to all this energy, and you could burn it off and, achieve more inner peace. People don't have inner peace. When your energy's stuck, it's just not possible. And sitting in front of a computer or sitting with your face in your phone all day just doesn't promote that. It doesn't promote people to read. It doesn't promote people to go outside and take a walk. And I was talking to a friend the other day. It's like, yeah, it was a whole lot easier before all the electronic stuff because there wasn't anything else to do.
That's exactly right. That is exactly right. Because I look at how it was when I was, let's say when I was in school, in high school. Then when you have kids, you see how they lived their life as children, and then you look at your grandchildren, and it progresses, but it's not really progression. You're right. Electronics has so much involved. I mean, it influences so much of what we do nowadays. Mm-hmm. So, do you think that modern humans experience more psychological illness than our ancestors?
Interesting question. I mean, my knee-jerk reaction would be to say no.
Right.
But then there are other factors that get into it, because we live in bigger communities, bigger cities. There's a lot more influence and pressure. There's what society brings to the table. Then there's the whole medication thing that you have to kind of throw on the table. And then there's, the foods we eat and the air we breathe and the water we drink. I think all of that has to get put onto the table, which could add to people having psychological issues. But is it really a true psychological issue, or is it something that's been created because we haven't taken care of ourselves?
Right. You mentioned something earlier about terraforming, and now when you say that, you're talking about terraforming as far as panspermia, or are you talking about some type of intellectual life form or being causing terraforming on Earth?
I'm going to start with panspermia.
Right.
Directed panspermia, that there was a group that actually facilitated that. But then as you read these stories, and I'm going to use Greek cosmology as the example, but there was the war between Zeus and Kronos that occurred. And after that war, there was another terraforming event that occurred. So there was the initial, and I'm going to say, seeding of the planet. But then after this war that happened, basically the way the storyline reads is that, their bones became the mountains and their hair became the trees and the plants and their blood became the water, and so that's one that's tied to this event. But then there's another parallel, or not parallel myth, but narrative where they went and like a bug went down to the bottom of the water and pulled up a little mud, and then dry land formed. Or they put a stick down into the water and pulled up a little mud and dry land formed. And so there's this secondary terraforming event that you also find, which seems like, and there are characters and people that are tied to this thing happening. And so I do feel like It was consciously directed at some point in time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it seems that there very well may have been. I mean, it's when you read about how many extinction cycles that have actually happened on the Earth, yeah, it is kind of mind blowing, and wondering how it started over from the beginning again. How many times it had to happen, and what kind of other influence had been involved with that. Are we ever going to be able to find out the true history of this planet, and especially involving life?
Well, when you talk about humanity, and I didn't realize this until I was researching this book. So researchers will sit there and they kind of talk about like Australopithecus and, Homo robustus and and all these different characters, in our lineage or parallel lineages or whatever. And where it gets really interesting is that they make these huge claims based on a piece of a jawbone, a leg bone. I mean, I feel like, and I probably am exaggerating here, but I feel like if you took all of the bones that have been found, you could probably put them inside a box, because it doesn't seem like there has been all that much collected. Now, when you talk about the Devonians, I mean, there was a piece of a pinky and a tooth. That was it. Now, the only reason I give them any credit at all is they've been able to look at the genetic record, the DNA that came out of those bones, out of that fossil record. So they actually have something concrete to work with versus, it's a piece of a jawbone. I mean, how can you recreate an entire individual based on a piece of a jawbone?
Exactly.
But in turn, we have this broad-reaching and extensive and very deep mythological record that has been passed on generation to generation to generation, and they won't even look at it. They won't consider it, and it just has been pushed to the side and poo-pooed. And I'm like, wait a minute. I've written 2 books on the topic, and you have like one little baby box. And I'm only like skimming the surface. I mean, it just seems unreasonable when there is just such a rich record to just ignore it in lieu of a little box of evidence.
Right.
Baby box.
But that being said, how much of the narrative in the Bible can be directly connected to non-terrestrial influence? For instance, angel contact, massive destruction, etc.
I mean, where my area of specialty is looking at what's considered the creation myth.
Right.
And so, although I'll make some commentary to more answer your question.
Sure.
And so when you look at the book of Genesis, so from in the beginning up until the flood narrative, that storyline is very consistent with what you see around the world. And I call that the global mythic narrative. It's the early myths, and you find the same stories, basically. I mean, they're different, but they're the same all around the world.
Right.
All around the world. And I was talking about the terraforming event after the war, and when I was working on my last book, E.T. Chronicles, I wanted to look at the 7 days of creation story, and incorporate that, because I kept finding these stories that started with like in the beginning, or not in the beginning, but the earth was void, and it was this abyss, and it was very consistent. So I kind of used that as my template. but on the, all right, I have to sit here on the third day. I think it's the third day. It might be the fourth day, so don't hold me to this.
Okay.
God creates the plants and trees, of the earth.
Right.
And then on the next day, so the fourth day, he puts the sun, the moon, and the stars in the sky, which you read and it's like, okay, but what about photosynthesis? Because that really wouldn't work without it. So my initial thought was, maybe they got the days mixed up. You could come up with a lot of different explanations of, why the sun didn't go into the sky until after the plants. Until I started doing all of this digging. And one of the things that I found was we have this war, we have this terraforming event, and then the next piece of narrative talks about, and then the sun, the moon, and the stars were put in the sky. So weird as it may be, it's consistent. Mm-hmm. So one of the things I talk about in Stepping Out of Eden is the viewpoint of the myths. And so in these early myths, in these creation myths, which go up to the flood, the stories are all told, and I like to say, from the viewpoint of the gods. They're right there in the middle of the action. So, Lon, if you and I were hanging out and, doing whatever, it would be, Lon went and did this thing, and, then he went and did that thing, and it would be, third person, but third person familiar. Mm-hmm. Because we're hanging out and I'm just telling the story. But after the flood, there's no more global narrative. And so every culture starts creating their own mythic record for their culture. But the viewpoint changes. It changes from the stories of the gods to the stories of men interacting with the gods.
Right.
And so I like using Moses as an example because Moses goes and he climbs up Mount Sinai, and instead of like hanging out with God, he is demure and respectful, and he takes his shoes off. And there is this air of, God is superior, and I have to, be in awe of him. And you see this major change, so think of Moses on the mountain. But that change is in all of the stories. Now we're praying to the gods, and we're asking them for their help and support, and we're not hanging out with them. Before we were like hanging out with the gods, and now we're subservient to some deity that is outside of our reach, except for in the hands of a select number of individuals. And so what you find is that, people like Moses, I always like to throw in Jason and the Argonauts. Jason interacts with the gods.
Right.
But it's very select individuals, and it's not the gods hanging out with all of humanity. But there are a number of instances in the Bible where, God shows up, but again, it's very select individuals that he is dealing with.
Right.
And then they talk about the angels, but it's kind of like, okay, so are we really just talking about a lesser god? Because there were the chief gods, and then there were lesser gods who had roles in all of these books as well.
Well, I never really gave the angels much consideration. I really hate to say that. I'm not a religious person anyway. I look at everything on a historical basis, basically. And but until I started reading the books of Enoch and the stories in the books of Enoch and relationship to the angels and how that incorporates itself in the Bible and the people in the Bible, there's really a historical story there somewhere.
Yeah. Enoch was taken to the heavens. to be with the gods and was educated by the gods. I mean, stories of humans or hybrid humans going and up to the heavens is a fairly common, not super common, but a fairly common theme that you'll find in mythology. You know, so it's not out of the ballpark of, you know, the question I ask is, you know, and I can't, Arathis. You know, there's a story that comes out of Sumerian, the Epic of Arathis, and he goes up to the heavens and interacts with Anu, the chief god of the Anunnaki.
Right.
You know, and it doesn't talk about him being educated, but he is taken up to the heavens. You know, so is that a parallel? Kind of hard to tell. You know, there really aren't stories of people being taken to the heavens to be taught, but I can't rule it out because there are a number of stories of people being taken up to the heavens to interact with the gods for one reason or another.
All right. Well, you know, I've always been fascinated with the Egyptian dynasties in the history of Egypt. But, you know, as I've gotten older, I've just wanted more. You know, there are it seems like every year something new comes up as far as the history of Egypt. Something's discovered or something's added or whatever. But I'm more interested in its connection to the Bible, like the Exodus it fascinates me, Exodus, because I think there's more Egyptian influence in this than what's written in the Bible. And as far as the beginning of the Egyptian civilization, I think it goes much further than the record, and may involve other empires that actually developed into the Egyptian civilization. But, you know, this also goes back to polytheism in the Egyptian religion, and then that brief Amarna period where there was monotheism and how that influenced Moses, or the person who was known as Moses. I think there's a tie in there, and I just, you know, I try to make a quest to try to figure out what is actually going on. And there have been books written about this, about certain pharaohs or family of pharaohs that may have actually been Moses. I mean, even Sigmund Freud wrote a book about it. It's just, I don't know. What are your thoughts on that? I mean, you talk about Moses, so what are your thoughts on that?
I think a lot of, two things. One, I find studying Egyptian cosmology really challenging because the seat of power moved so many times in 3,000 years that it's hard to, I don't think anyone has written a book, or I have yet to find it, of this is where the culture was from a God perspective, you know, and then it moved here and they changed the name to this, you know, and so it's hard to even figure out, you know, okay, so here's this pyramid text, but where does it fit in the timeline? You know, it's just very disjointed to me. But I love freaking Egypt.
I'm like you.
I think everybody loves Egypt.
Yeah, it is.
You know, but then there's, I think, a whole level of whitewash that happens. You know, every so often you'll hear, you know, like I'm pretty good friends with Brian Forrester, you know, and I would make when he and I were talking a lot, I would make some comment and he would say, oh, but, you know, when you talk to so-and-so, you know, I don't remember his name, you know, who was from an elder family, you know, it's like you get a totally different story of what the history is. And so have we just covered it over and just made up our own history for what's going on in Egypt and don't want to listen to the local people that have the indigenous story? And I'm going to give it a much an example that I know much better.
Mm-hmm.
So Sacsayhuaman is in Peru. And I think anyone listening to your show has probably seen it's that big wall where all of the stones just fit together super perfectly.
Yeah.
And, and you can't figure out how the heck they did it because it's like a jigsaw puzzle with no instructions.
Yep.
And so the scientific line, the historical line to how that was built was that 50 years prior to the Spanish coming there, that's when the native people built it. And then somehow, by the end of that period of time, they lost all of their technology and they couldn't do it anymore. But they only built it 50 years before the Spanish. But if you asked any of the indigenous people who built it, they say that it was there when they showed up to the land and that it was built by giants. So it's kind of like, all right, so where did they get this 50-year thing?
Mm-hmm.
Where did the West get this 50-year thing? They just made it up.
Sure.
Because it fits in their timeline and it fits in the Bible timeline that, everything started 6,000 years ago. And I mean, we all know about Göbekli Tepe, and they still kind of just push it to the side because they can't incorporate it into anything, and that was built, at least 10,000 BC.
Yeah, that's another thing. Like, it is so difficult to even imagine that people back then had any type of technology to be able to develop the type of structures and such. And, the learned people will not come out and say, oh yeah, well, GT or somebody else came in there and did it. It takes people those people who are open-minded enough and not afraid to say things. Like you said, Brian Forster. I mean, his work, in Peru is just unbelievable. But
Mm-hmm.
it does take that, and that's the reason why I always was interested in archaeology. You need to be so open-minded about things because the record is just not there. And you talk about whitewash. Well, look at the Egyptians. It's so many times that they just tried to erase the record of the previous pharaoh. Mm-hmm. And it takes, and I'm pretty sure there are more pharaohs or leaders or such that we just have no idea existed. But you're right. I mean, Egyptian history, and whatever influenced those people over those millennia is just a mind-blowing concept, to be quite honest, and that's just the way I feel about it.
Well, and there's this whole notion that life didn't exist before writing, right. And it's kind of like, you'll appreciate this. And so the earliest written document that mentions a ghost was the Epic of Gilgamesh,
right,
which was written about 2500 BC, or at least was written down on a piece of paper, 2500 BC. But how old, so they're like, oh, well, the Epic of Gilgamesh is from 2500 BC. It's like, well, no, not really. It was written down in 2500 BC. It doesn't mean that they came up with the story then, and you have to sit there and argue with people about, the difference between the actual date and the date that it was put on a piece of paper, or stone or clay tablet or whatever you want to put it on, which might be two totally different things, and so we have this history, and so we just assume that because the first piece of written evidence, documented evidence, is at a certain point in time, doesn't mean that the belief wasn't there long before that.
Now, I'm going to ask you a question that's a little bit away from what we have been talking about, but this is about non-terrestrial craft travelers, or I believe for the most part, interdimensional corporeal beings. I mean, is it possible that, we see people see UFOs?
Mm-hmm.
Are these interstellar spacecraft, or are these craft more interdimensional craft that are actually propelled by corporeal beings?
Yeah, and we don't know. I mean, it goes right along with the time traveler thing. I mean, because they could be time travelers themselves, and this is how they get around, until a ship lands on the White House lawn, or, actually, I'm going to take that back. Until they release the documents that share that bit of information. I mean,
that's what I was thinking when you said that.
We have a bunch of testimonial from people, about their experiences, but they're crackpots, and and you can't believe anything that they say, which is really sad, and so I mean, I think it's interesting that we're waiting for something to come through official channels for us to accept.
Right. Yeah, right. You're right. I don't believe that's ever going to happen unless there's a need to know situation where it has to be disclosed somehow.
Well, I think when some big ship, parks itself over a building, kind of like Independence Day, there's not going to be any way that they can cover that up.
Yeah, that'll be it. That's it. I don't know how much that I've been involved with this the situation in Chicago where people have been seeing these winged humanoid beings.
I mean, I've heard about that, but I've just kind of gone, that's interesting. I mean, have you seen one? I mean, 'cause that would be like the totally coolest thing.
Well, the number of reports we have received is just staggering, and the witness testimony that we received is just, people not been embellishing on what they see. They stick to what their original story is, which is something that very rarely happens as far as crypto reporting, Mm-hmm. But, the thing that's fascinated me more than anything about this whole situation is, like, where in the hell are these things coming from? I've always had this thought that cryptids, Bigfoot in particular, or other cryptids, may be interdimensional beings, but they're corporal. They're flesh and blood beings, as what people are reporting in Chicago. I'm
going to throw something out just to kind of put it in your mind. So in the mythic record, one of the things that we find is that some of the gods had technology that gave them certain abilities. So like Freya, for example, had a feathered cloak, and it allowed her to soar through the air like an eagle. And so it could be that they're not necessarily cryptids, and I'm not making commentary one way or the other, right, but they're utilizing some form of technology to give them the wings so that they can fly.
Yeah.
Just saying.
Yeah. Well, I am open to all possibilities at this point. Even though the sightings have waned off so much, I mean, I am going to be digging into this for forever, I'm afraid. Even though I wrote a book about it, I have no conclusions to it, So.
Well, and it's almost impossible when you're working in this area. It's almost actually, I'd rather people not have a conclusion, because you can't have a conclusion because we don't know.
No, we don't know. That's exactly right. I hear grief about it. People want me to give them my opinion as to what it is, but I really don't want to do that. I'm leaving all options open. So.
Well, and I get the same grief. It's like, yeah, but you didn't you didn't make any conclusions. It's like, it's not my job. I'm just supposed to present
right.
the information. Here's
Exactly.
the information, and you come to your own conclusion.
Well, Rita, can tell us how people can contact you, and what events do you have coming up, and anything else you want to throw in there?
Sure. The best way to find me is by going to my website, soulhealer.com, SOULHEALER.com, or just type in, Rita Louise in any search engine. You'll totally find me. You can friend me or like my Facebook page. It would be Dr. Rita Louise on Facebook, or you can, find me on Twitter, which would be Psychic Doc on Twitter. Event-wise, let's see, I'll be at the History Haunts and Legends Conference November 6th, 3rd, 5th. I don't know, the first Saturday in November. I just know it's the first Saturday in November, and I just show up. Because this will be like my 13th year participating in that event. So, and that's pretty much it for this year. Probably going to be starting to do a bunch more writing now that this book is done. I don't know. I might have to write an article about the dynamic of crazy, because actually that would be kind of interesting.
Yeah, it would be interesting. Well, Rita, thanks so much for joining me. I really appreciate you coming on, and hope I can get you on a little quicker than next time.
Well, that would be great. I would love it, because, you're a great guy, excellent show, and we'll have to do that.
Okay, you take care and have a great weekend.
You too. Thanks. Bye.
Listeners can show their support for Arcane Radio by becoming a patron. Simply go to phantomsandmonsters.com and click the Podbean patron banner. Now, Arcane Radio will be on a 2-week hiatus, and we will return on Friday, November 2nd. Now, before I go, allow me to leave this with the listeners. The late physicist and cosmologist Stephen Hawking once stated, "Shouldn't we be content to be cosmic sloths, enjoying the universe from the comfort of Earth?" The answer is no. The Earth is under threat from so many areas that it is difficult for me to be positive. Well, I guess you can take anything from that you want. I thank everyone for listening to the show, and good night, and have a great weekend.